Okay, good morning, people. How are we doing this morning? So Thika's here. Good morning, Thika. Good morning, Manish. Good morning, Mashid. Good morning, Benamer. Ivan's here. Good evening to you, Ivan. Casey's here. Good morning, Casey. Monica. Hello, Monica. Hello, Erica. How's everyone feeling today? What's an emoji that describes your feeling? What's an emoji that describes your feeling today? I'm looking for mine, but I kind of think it's this one. A little sleepy. Okay. Let's see. Jenna looks pretty happy. Banamer looks super happy. Morning, Zhuang. Monica looks kind of I don't know. Are you feeling lovey, or are you feeling like intellectual, or is one of your emojis in love with the other emoji? I don't know. I don't know what that means, but that's okay. That's okay. Um, how's Casey? Casey looks. Oh, that's Energy Day. That's what that means. Okay. Casey looks pretty happy. That's good. Um, okay, well, not too many sleepy people except for me. That's good. As I say, sometimes people get worn out by Thursday, so I'm glad you're all kind of happy and awake and ready to go. What we'll do today, really quickly, is we will finish up talking about Indigenous people's experience in Canada. I had you watch that little video, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then we'll move on. I have a little bit to talk about in terms of the social messaging about white supremacy. We'll go back a little bit to the internalized dominance and internalized oppression thing. And I have a little something for you to read on white supremacy that we can talk about. Maybe a little bit today, maybe a little bit tomorrow. There's pieces in the thing I want you to read that I also might bring back in the next unit when we talk about sexism. So it might be useful for that reason too. There's stuff that we can use for both units. Okay, so maybe without any further delay, I'll hop in here. So yesterday we finished watching this video, Eighth Fire, right? And again, there's other parts to this documentary, and so if you really enjoyed it, you can watch the other parts. I think there's Good Morning Baha. There's about I forget if there's 3 or 5 other parts to this series, Eighth Fire. But the section of the documentary we watched was just about Indigenous people kind of trying to rediscover themselves and find a place for themselves in cities, right? And so, of course, Wab Canoe, he hosted it, and we went through all of these questions, right? And so one of the things that I think that we saw right at the beginning of that documentary was that First Nations people in Canada are grappling with a number of stereotypes, and most of them are negative, right? So there are feelings that Aboriginal people are lazy, or that they just want special treatment from the government, which of course they've had special treatment from the government, but not in a good way. There's stereotypes about tendency for alcohol or substance abuse. There's stereotypes around crime or gang membership. There's stereotypes about their tax issues, that they don't pay any tax, or they get lots of free money from the government. And really, all of these are pretty much untrue. Although, again, there is, there are elements of truth to all of them, and that's part of that's part of the reason why stereotypes are so difficult to get rid of, is because sometimes the result of those stereotypes creates situations where the stereotypes appear to be confirmed, right? I mean, you could look at laziness. Well, I mean, if you're more likely to be unemployed, and if you're unemployed, then you don't have anything to do, and then it looks like you're lazy. But you're not lazy, it's just that people don't want to hire you, right? So you have this sort of element of truth, but it's actually caused by the stereotype. It's not, the stereotype doesn't describe what you're seeing. The stereotype is causing what you're seeing. The same thing with alcohol and substance abuse problems. Yes, some Indigenous communities have issues with this, but of course it doesn't mean that every Aboriginal person does, right? There is crime, there is gang membership, right? Doesn't apply to everyone. Some people are involved in those things. Tax issues. Indigenous people don't get free money from the government. They pay taxes like the rest of us. Do they have some differences in the way that their taxes are filed with the government? Yes, they do. But do they get a bunch of free money? No. So again, these stereotypes have little grains of truth in them, but they're not true in themselves. And in some cases, the stereotype actually causes more problems than it explains, really. So First Nations people are grappling with a lot of these negative stereotypes, but again, what I wanted to drive home here is that we're looking at a living culture, a living group of people. And again, in spite of a very destructive history, a destructive relationship with Canada and the Canadian government, these people are still here, and they are trying to sort of rebuild their culture and reimagine their place in the world that we have here. And yeah, that's what they're trying to do. And so in the documentary, we met a few people who are trying to do this through their art. And so Stephen Kiwatin Sanderson, who was the illustrator, the comic book artist. We met Kent Monkman, who's the visual and performance artist. We met Herb Varley, the photographer. And we met some musicians, the guys from Winnipeg's Most. I happened to Google them, actually. I happened to Google Winnipeg's Most yesterday, and they're not still together. One of the guys, I guess the police raided his house and may have found some cocaine, so he had some legal issues. One of the guys is dead now. I'm not sure why. There was no cause of death. So, again, even though we saw some people who were sort of, reclaiming their culture, reclaiming their lives, and doing positive things, sometimes these people still struggle, right? And so the guys from Winnipeg's Most clearly had some struggles with the law and probably with other things. And so there's steps forward, and then there's steps back, I guess, is what I'm saying here. And good morning, Justin. So the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians is still a difficult one. And so here, the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and this national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, both of those have been completed, and calls to action have been issued. And that's why I asked you to watch that video with Senator Murray Sinclair. And so Murray Sinclair, as I mentioned, is a senator, but he was also a commissioner. He was part of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as I showed you, or as I asked you to look at, they issued, the commission issued a set of calls to action. And again, I just wanted you to briefly look over some of these, and there's 94 of them. And so the commission spent years listening to people's stories, their experiences in Indian residential schools. and the commission came up with this set of recommendations. And so the idea here is that if the Canadian government wants to reconcile with Indigenous people, if they want to repair the relationship, this is what you should do. These are the steps that you should take. And so, you may look at these, and I asked you to look at them very quickly because there's just really too much for us to read. You may look at these and you might say, well, that's a lot of stuff, right? There's 94 things to do here. That's a lot, and it is a lot, but I think it also speaks to how much needs to be fixed, right? If you and I have a relationship and we have 94 things to fix, that's a lot, right? That says something about where our relationship is, right? It says something about the level of inequality between non-Indigenous Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. If we were really close, then, we could probably fix 2 things and we'd be done, right? But the fact that there are 94 things to fix, just in this report alone, shows you that there's a pretty big disparity. There's a pretty big inequality between the lives that non-Indigenous Canadians live and the lives that Indigenous Canadians live, right? And so a lot needs to be done, a lot needs to be fixed. And as Murray told us, as you heard him speak about, a few things have been done, but the progress has been really slow, right? And so that video, I think, was from 2018, so it's about 2 years ago. I haven't been keeping track of it, but I would say not too much has changed since then. And so, again, progress is slow, and people who are not Indigenous people tend to kind of forget about this stuff because it's not doesn't seem to affect their daily life. But one of the things that Murray Sinclair said, and that I would like to say to you, is that we're all here in the same country, right? And you're going to reconcile one way or another. You're going to have a relationship one way or another. The question is just what kind of a relationship do you want? And so for him, he said it's not a question of are we going to have a relationship, because of course we are. We're going to live in the same country for ever and ever. And so what do we want that relationship to be like? The other thing I'd like to say to you is that I know some of you aren't in Canada right now, but if you are in Canada, or if you plan on being in Canada and maybe staying in Canada and living and working here, which would be lovely, we'd love to have you. If you want to do that, you will become part of this conversation. And so this isn't a process between people with my color of skin and Indigenous people. This is a conversation for all Canadians to have. And so even if you come here and you go to school here, and maybe you get your PR and you start to work here, and maybe you become a citizen eventually, which would be great. If you do that, that means you are part of this conversation too. You don't sort of get to sit out and say, oh, well, that's that's white Canadians' problems, or that's European Canadians' problems. It's all of our problem, right? And we all have to think about it and address it. And so again, if you are here, or if you want to be here, that would be great. But you will become part of the conversation. It will be part of your responsibility to help move this forward however you can. Sorry, but yeah. So again, we have these 2 reports from the TRC and from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. The reports have been created, calls to action have been issued, and not too much has happened, right? We have the Indian Act, which is still in force. we read yesterday in the slides that um, a Canadian federal government minister has been tasked with dismantling the Indian Act, but that's going to be much more difficult than it sounds. Um, you can't just repeal the Indian Act, you can't just remove it from circulation, because as racist as it once was, and as problematic as it still is, it is the thing that creates a legal relationship between Indigenous people and the government. And so to just get rid of it means that there is no kind of legal connection between these two. And while many Indigenous people don't want the Indian Act and don't like the Indian Act, many Indigenous people don't want it to be thrown out either, because that's their relationship, right? It's almost like the marriage certificate, right? It's the marriage certificate between these two. And so to throw that out means that there's no legal connection between these two people and nothing is owed to them. And so even though the Indian Act is a problem, it's also the thing that connects these two entities together. And so many people don't want to just throw it out either. And that's part of the issue around trying to reconcile too, is that there are a lot of different views in terms of what reconciliation looks like and what should be done. Okay, and so it's not clear. It's not clear entirely how we're going to get where we need to go. And again, evidence of systemic racism in terms of the statistics we see, and evidence of mistreatment by police continues to appear. And so this showed up. This is sort of making. This is in the news cycle right now. As you can see, it was just published yesterday, where RCMP officers in northern Alberta used excessive force against a First Nations chief and his wife for having an expired license plate. And so this happened a few months ago, but it's just coming to public attention right now. And again, we see Chief Alan Adam. He's not the only one to suffer this kind of excessive force by the police, by RCMP. So again, we're seeing that there is more awareness around what has happened to Indigenous people in the past. There's more awareness about the kind of lives that Indigenous people are living right now in the present. But there's still a lot of things to fix, and a lot of things remain unfixed. And so this is very much an ongoing issue in Canada, and will be for quite some time. Yeah. Okay. So, are there any questions about that, about Indigenous people in Canada, about things that you wanted answered that weren't, things that you would like to say or express connected to Indigenous people and racism in Canada? Is there anything you want to say, or are we good with that? Can we switch gears a little bit? Maybe just let me know. And let me know if you're awake too. I know my voice is very soothing and it might put you to sleep, but or maybe not. But what do you think? Are we good? Can we move on, or is there something else that you would briefly like to discuss or investigate or clear up? Maybe there's something that you're confused about. Why they do not take money from the government? Well, this is a good question, Baha. Basically, what I'll say here is I am not an expert in tax law, and so I don't know. First Nations people do have some added benefits in terms of taxes, in terms, sometimes they are exempt from GST in certain situations. Their taxes get filed differently. I don't think they pay income tax if they make their living on reserve, on their reserve. But again, so few people actually make their living on the reserve that it doesn't really amount to anything. I guess what I want to say is, even though I'm not an expert in all of the ins and outs of how federal and provincial taxes affect Indigenous people, what I do want to say is that there is a stereotype floating around Canada that Indigenous people do get free money from the government and they don't pay any taxes, and they're just they're freeloading, and none of that is true. There are some different tax laws that are associated with Indigenous people, but the benefit is not what you think, and so they're not making huge amounts of money from the government. And again, if you look at the statistics, you'll see that actually Indigenous people are on the whole making less money than everyone else. And so if you think about it that way, they're paying less tax than anyone else, because usually the amount of tax you pay is connected to how much money you make or how much money you spend. And so if you don't make a lot of money and you don't spend a lot of money, you don't pay a lot of tax either. And so I would say they're not necessarily getting free money from the government. They're actually on the whole, they are sort of making less money than the rest of us. Okay, so Mashid is good, Thika's good. Karen says, why? Why don't they get rid of the Indian Act since they now have the Reconciliation Act as a... well, I don't think they're... There really is no Reconciliation Act. And so what this is, Karen, I'm just going to jump back here. So what this is the result of a royal commission, okay? And so here in Canada, we've had a few royal commissions before. We have them sometimes. And what a royal commission is a very fancy term for if I'm the government needs an answer to something. It doesn't know what the answer is. So it gets a bunch of smart people together, sends them off and says, go find the answer to this question, and then come back and tell us what the answer is. That's what a royal commission basically is. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is kind of like that, where they sent off a bunch of experts to say, we clearly have a problem with Indian residential schools. How do we get past this? How do we solve it? And so the commission went out, it listened to a bunch of people, it came back to the government and said, that question on Indian residential schools, here's what you need to do. Here's our report. And so what we were looking at here just a second ago, that's their report. So it's not a law. It has no legal force. They're just recommendations. They're just, they're recommendations. So the commission is saying, if you want to fix this problem, here's what you need to do. All 94. And so it's not a law, and so it doesn't really do anything on its own, unfortunately. And again, the Indian Act it's a double-edged sword. It's good and it's bad at the same time. Again, it was created for negative purposes, right? It was created to assimilate and control Indigenous people. A lot of the assimilation stuff and the really racist stuff has been pulled out of it, so it's not exactly the same as it was when it was first passed in 1876. but it still structures the lives of Indigenous people in a way that it doesn't for non-Indigenous Canadians. So the Indian Act, there's nothing in the Indian Act that applies to someone like me. Okay, so it only applies to Indigenous people. But again, it's kind of like a marriage certificate. It's the legal thing that binds Indigenous people to the Canadian government and creates the relationship. And so without the Indian Act, there's no legal connection between these two things. And the question is that what anyone wants? To answer your question a little more, Justin Trudeau's dad, he was prime minister in the late 60s and early 70s. So Pierre Elliott Trudeau, if you've ever heard of or seen him. So Pierre Trudeau was prime minister of Canada, and in 1969, he kind of had the idea that we would do this. Okay, so he had an idea that, he wanted a just, equal society in Canada. And his idea was, well, we can't have an equal society if some people have special laws and rights and privileges that apply to them. And he was talking about Indigenous people. So his idea was that the only way we can have a just society is that for everyone to have the same. And so he and one of his government ministers created a plan, which wound up being called the White Paper. Had nothing to do with white skin, but the White Paper. And in the White Paper, it said we should get rid of the Indian Act. We should make everyone equal, and that way, Indigenous people won't be held back by this Indian Act. They'll be free to live their lives and pursue their goals just like every other Canadian. Which again sounded good on the surface, but when Indigenous groups read it, in many cases they were really upset because again, they felt like the Canadian government was just washing their hands of Indigenous people. So they made these agreements hundreds of years ago with First Nations people. They didn't live up to them. They did a bunch of horrible things. And now that it's become complicated, the government just wants to, oh, well, let's just forget about all that and let's all be equal. That's kind of what Indigenous people thought about the White Paper. And so the White Paper was released, people read it, there was kind of a big uproar, and then nobody did anything because there was really no support for getting rid of it at the time. So again, the Indian Act is a controversial thing. People have different opinions about it, and they do because, yes, it only applies to First Nations people. Yes, it creates outcomes that are not desirable, but it is the thing that holds these two together. And so many people don't just want to get rid of it, because then how will we create a new relationship between Indigenous people and between the Canadian government? And so it's tempting to just get rid of that thing, but many people are not many people don't want to get rid of it. And that's actually so you said form here. So the Reconciliation Act as a form of relationship. Well, again, that's the issue, is that there's no legal basis. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report has no legal basis, and so it's just recommendations, right? We think you should do this. If the government were to follow all of those steps, so if the government went ahead and did all of this stuff, some of those would be passed into law, and so some of them could become legal. They could become they could structure the legal relationship between people. But again, as we've heard, not too much has happened. So, and that's what Murray Sinclair is saying in the video, right? He said, when he talks to government leaders, he says, you have no plan. Your problem is you have no plan for reconciliation. Here is a plan. We've given you one. just follow it. But again, that hasn't really happened yet. So yeah, it's difficult to know how this is going to proceed. It's possible that we may not get real meaningful change unless something bad happens. I think we're seeing that in the United States, where we've various groups, but Black Americans have been experiencing racism and systemic racism for some time, and change only really comes when things get really uncomfortable, right? When somebody dies, video is circulated, people get really upset, they are protesting in the streets, and then you see governments and police departments and other groups start to make changes. And so sometimes change doesn't really come when everything is just kind of calm and relaxed. It comes when people get really upset over something. And so it's possible that we are going to need something in Canada that makes everybody really upset in order to get some of these changes to happen. But yeah, I think we're going in the right direction. I think we're on the path, but we're going pretty slow. Things are going pretty slow. Oops. Things are going pretty slow. Okay. Just as a quick review, because this is transitioning into something else. This is a bit of a gear change, okay? So we read this article already, Race and Gender Oppression in the Classroom. I know I'm switching gears here. Gear change. Race and Gender in the Classroom, experience of women faculty of color with white male students. And we said that white male students were acting in ways that resulted in these women professors of color experiencing gendered racism, right? So we saw predominantly white male students challenge their authority and their teaching competency and their scholarly expertise, and in some cases intimidate or threaten them as part of their interactions, right? And so we said that for the white male students, this was them expressing their internalized dominance, okay? So they were acting in ways that undermined or disrespected or challenged these women of color because these white male students have received social messages that they are in some way superior, okay? Or that female professors of color are not as powerful, okay, or are inferior. And so again, they're acting out these social messages. I'm not sure how aware they are of it, but they are acting it out. But we also saw the professors, these women of color, acting out their internalized oppression, right? So some of them felt fearful, which is reasonable, and frustrated and disrespected. Some of them felt like they had to make sure that they behaved in a certain way in order to maintain authority, and in ways that a white male professor wouldn't have had to worry about. And again, a lot of the things that they experienced, they questioned whether their race or their gender was part of it. And again, that's part of what it is to be part of a minoritized group in a society, is that sometimes if you encounter a weird situation or an uncomfortable situation, or somebody is being a bit of a jerk, there's always the question in the back of people's mind, was that because I am, of this race or this gender or sexuality or religion, right? Was there a racial element to this interaction, or was there not? And so there's a lot of second guessing sometimes that happens for people in minoritized groups. So the question is, why do some of these white male students act as they do? And as usual, socialization and stereotypes and internalized domination are at play. But before we get to that, I think we should probably take a little bit of a break because we've been working pretty hard here for 50 minutes. So take a break, stretch your legs, come back, and we'll talk a little bit about these sort of messages of white superiority, and then we'll talk about white supremacy. Okay, so take a break, and I'll see you back here shortly. Okay. Okay, people, and we're back. So we switched gears. We switched gears from our talk about Indigenous people in Canada. Um, the one thing I just want to throw in here, and it's too late. I missed my opportunity to say it before, but I was thinking it. You know, when we're talking about genocide or cultural genocide in Canada, and did it happen or did it not happen? I wanted to get you to recall what we talked about very early on when we talked about the power of socialization and of culture for humans. And I think if you remember, the metaphor or the analogy I was using was that humans are computers, right? And we're born, but we're born without any operating system. And so as we grow up throughout our lives, we go through this process of socialization, right? We're sort of downloading our operating system from the people around us, right? That's how we learn to eat and walk and interact with others and speak and, know right from wrong and know the kind of things we want to do with our lives. And yeah, it's a very complex, it's the world's most complex operating system, right? And we download it into our brains as we grow up. But I wanted to challenge you to imagine what's happened for many Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous kids in Indian residential schools, where the main purpose of those schools was to delete their operating system, right? Like Murray Sinclair said, they weren't trying to kill these kids, they weren't trying to destroy the computer, they were trying to delete the operating system and add in another one. And so, imagine, if you will, for a second, imagine if I went into your computer that you're watching me on right now and I started just deleting files out of nowhere, right? If I just, oh, I don't like this file, I'm going to get rid of this. Oh, I don't like this program, I'm going to delete that and I'm going to install something else. If I spent some time doing that, how well do you think your computer would work? It wouldn't. It would be a disaster, right? You can't just go into your computer and start deleting random files that you don't know what they do and that you just don't like, right? Your computer will not operate properly. And again, that's what's happened here, is that through a long process of disease, discrimination, and then sort of brutalization and assimilation in Indian residential schools, the Canadian government has tried to delete the operating system of Indigenous people. And so, again, if you imagine the computer analogy, you can't just go and try to cut out large parts of the operating system and expect things to continue working well, right? And again, things are not working well. Sorry, that was just something that I had thought of. I thought it was a good analogy, and I missed my opportunity to add it in before, so I added it in now. Now I'm going to switch gears back to what we were talking about, okay? Sorry about that. So, we said that in cultures in the West here, in the US and Canada, sometimes we find people acting out their internalized dominance. We see them acting in ways that demonstrates their superiority over minoritized groups. And again, in many cases, I would say that this is unconscious and unintentional. So the people in dominant groups don't realize that they're doing it so much. But people in minoritized groups feel it, right? They feel that something's wrong. They feel that they are being, they feel the kind of aggression in it. And so even if a person in the dominant group acts out their internalized dominance and doesn't realize they're doing it, it can still have negative impacts on people in minoritized groups, okay? And so, again, well, where do some of these messages come from? Where does that internalized dominance come from? Well, up until very recently, and I'll say that I think this is changing now, particularly in popular media, but in the past, I think that white people in Canada and the US have received many messages that they are, in fact, better than people of other races or ethnicities. And you don't have to look very far in media to see this happening. Okay, so until recently, well, this is pretty recent, I would say. Um, Here are a collection of very popular television or streaming service shows. Okay, so we've got Breaking Bad in there. We've got Mad Men. We've got Two and a Half Men. We've got The Simpsons, which has been on TV for decades now. Family Guy's in there. Modern Family. Big Bang Theory. Game of Thrones, of course. Walking Dead. These are all reasonably popular television shows, but by and large, they are shows about white people, right? White people are the lead character. In many cases, the lead characters are white and male. And any people of other races or ethnicities are kind of just there for, they're there sort of to represent diversity, but they're not in the front line, right? They're not the subject of the show. And again, we've seen very recently we've seen some change in this. We've seen movies like Parasite become really popular, Crazy Rich Asians. We've seen The Farewell. We've seen the Netflix series Never Have I Ever. All of these are changing things because they're putting people of different races and ethnicities in the lead role. It's telling their story from their perspective, which is great. Finally, but again, you don't have to go too far in the past to find that most of the media that we're consuming is the story of white people. And again, the message here is that white people's stories are more interesting, right? That white people are cooler, and people of color are kind of just there for interest or to say a funny line. That's how many of these shows kind of have worked traditionally. Of course, Friends was huge and still is on Netflix. People love it, and they should love it. It's a good show. It's very funny. But again, there's really no diversity here, right? These are all white people. If you go even further back in history, you see comic books not being very diverse in the past either. All of these people are white, except for one green guy. So, so their diversity is, there are no Earth people here of any other race or ethnicity. The only diversity we have is a guy from another planet, and he's green. So, again, not very diverse, right? Even superheroes are predominantly white people, right? And so, what does that say? White people are, I don't know, more capable of being heroic, or sort of the source of ethics or morality? It's hard to say what the message is, but sometimes people learn these messages without realizing them. And so the people who are creating the Justice League or creating Friends, they're not trying to transmit these messages, but sometimes the messages get transmitted anyway, and people absorb them and learn them. Oh yeah, there's this guy. I'm sure you all know who this guy is. He's very popular. He's got his own book. He's got a very big fan club. I'm just kidding. This is of course Jesus, right? And in many places, in many expressions, this is how we see Jesus portrayed, right? Jesus is portrayed here as a white man, pretty good-looking white man, but he's a white man nonetheless. But it's important for us to remember, of course, that Jesus would not have been a white man, right? He comes from the Middle East. He comes from the sort of historical area of Palestine. And so even though we might be used to seeing him portrayed this way, recently a scientific team did some work and suggested, well, this would have been more what a Hebrew man 2,000 years ago would have looked like, Did Jesus look exactly like this? Probably not. But this is actually a much closer representation of what Jesus might have looked like rather than this, right? So this is a white guy. Jesus is a white guy, but in real life, the actual person of Jesus probably would have looked a lot closer to this. And so here we see again people, white people are kind of co-opting things and making themselves, the most superior thing. And so Jesus is, an expression of God, the Son of God, someone people worship and pray to, but he is seen as a white person. He's not seen as a person of color or a Middle Eastern person as he obviously was. We see it in a lot of religious artwork as well. If you know the story, here's Adam and Eve. Again, Adam and Eve are portrayed as white people. And so the message here, of course, is that the first people ever created were white, right? And again, first of all, that doesn't quite make sense because, again, the Garden of Eden is supposed to be in the Middle East, and so you would expect them to look Middle Eastern. You would expect them to look like people of color. Of course, scientifically speaking, we know that the first human beings, the first Homo sapiens, came from Africa. And so the first Homo sapiens, the first humans, were black. And so it's the exact opposite of what we see here. Here we see the Bible in an artistic expression of a Bible story being told from the perspective that the first people were white. But certainly from the Bible's perspective, the first people probably would have looked more like this. But from a scientific perspective, we know that the first people they were black, they were Africans. But again, we see whiteness being portrayed as kind of the original thing, right? The first thing created. We see whiteness being attached to godliness, right? As Jesus is portrayed as white. And again, we see in all kinds of different movies, white people are at the front, right? It's the story of white people told from the perspective of white people. And again, people of color are just kind of sprinkled into many of these things for interest's sake, kind of thing. And so these are some examples, and of course there's many, many, many more. These are some examples of indirect or implicit messaging, okay? And this kind of messaging is telling us that to be white is better, right? That white people are more important. That the default experience for humans is whiteness, right? That's what some of these things are telling us. And so again, we might disagree with this, and we should, I think, disagree with this. But again, we're all absorbing these social messages. We're all learning them anyway. And so it becomes difficult not to act on them. If we go back to movies for a second, not only are white people often in the lead role, and and in many cases the story is told from the perspective of white people, but when doing that, when creating a movie that is about white people from the white person's perspective, and when most of the movies are like that, basically you are one particular group, one small group of society are getting to define kind of what's normal, right? And so if you look here in the second bullet, a lot of these things, masculinity, right? What it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, femininity, ideas about sexuality or desire, or heroism, what it means to be a hero, or what adventure is about, or how families work, or how to fall in love, or how to resolve conflict. All of those stories are told in film, and we kind of learn about those things through film, right? We learn, how to be, how to be a man or how to be a woman, how to be a hero, what love is like. We often learn these things from movies, right? Or television. We see these things on the screen and we kind of imagine that, this is how it is, right? This is what these experiences are like, or what they should be like. But again, if we're watching those stories and we're learning all of these things, whose stories are they? Okay, and so consider this. So the 25 highest grossing films worldwide, so the 25 movies that made the most money around the world, are all directed by white people, except one. We have one person of color directing Furious 7, and we have one woman co-director for Frozen. But other than that, the 25 most popular movies around the world were all directed by white men. And for the top 100 films worldwide, 99 are directed by men and 95 by white people. So again, we have a very small group of people, white men, being able to define storytelling almost on a global scale, right? White men are able to transmit their ideas and their way of the world onto society as a whole. And again, it's not to say that their ideas are wrong. It's just to say that there are so many other perspectives. There's so many other viewpoints, and we don't hear them or see them. It seems like the only way to kind of see the world and to experience other people is through the eyes of white people, because that's really what most movies are showing us, right? Because again, they are the product of white people, and specifically white men. And again, thankfully that's starting to change now. We are seeing more women directors. We're seeing people of color and women of color. I mentioned a few important movies and television shows a few minutes ago. So things are starting to change, but historically speaking, a lot of media was generated by and for white people. And so in the process, white people get to transmit their values, their view of society, and whiteness begins to seem cool, because all of the cool things we see in movies, in many cases, are done by white people. And so it sort of transmits that idea of superiority, and it transmits the idea that this is just the way reality is. Reality is as white people see it. And again, that's not true. That's not how it is. Often these things kind of come together in movies that are very common, are getting less common, and they revolve around what they call a white savior narrative. Okay, and so the idea behind white savior movies, here's a few of them. So Dances with Wolves is here. That's an old one, but we heard Dances with Wolves being mentioned in the Eighth Fire video. Mississippi Burning, there's Free State here, Lincoln, Amistad, A Time to Kill. There's lots and lots of movies that are like this, and the way that they kind of work, the way that they kind of operate, is we have a white savior in this movie. So we have a white person who is usually the main character, and they basically go about rescuing people of color in some way. They might defend them in a murder trial. They might stand up for them in some other way. They might adopt a child of color. They might go to an exotic place. They might go to another country and help save people of color from some sort of plight or negative thing. There's lots of these white savior movies floating around, and again, they're kind of problematic because they put the source of power and morality and heroism in into white people, right? And people of color in these movies are sometimes seen as stereotypes. They're seen very stereotypically, or sometimes they seem, incapable of doing anything to help themselves, and so they need the white person to come in and save the day. One of the movies that breaks my heart, that follows this white savior narrative, but it does, is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And so I really enjoyed Indiana Jones movies when I was growing up, kind of a hero of mine. But if you've seen the Temple of Doom, and maybe in the comments you can let me know if you've seen this movie, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, is a classic white savior movie. And so, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you how it goes. But Indiana Jones, white male archaeologist, his plane crashes in India. And so he literally falls from the sky as a savior, falls from the sky, and discovers this village, this Indian village where things are going really bad, and this local king seems to have stolen all of this village's children. And so Indiana Jones goes to the palace, discovers what's going on. There's bad stuff happening at the palace. I won't ruin it all for you. But he defeats the bad guys, frees all of the children, and they all come back to the village at the end, and it's very happy, and parents are hugging their kids, and Indiana Jones has saved the day. And so it's a classic white savior movie where these Indian villagers are incapable of helping themselves for some reason, and they need this white guy to literally fall from the sky and rescue them all. And so there's some other problems with the movie too, but it's very classically a white savior movie, unfortunately. I still like it, but it's got some problems with it. And so Indiana Jones does just this, right? He is a white character who comes in and rescues people of color from their plight, from their situation. He learns something about himself in the process, which I won't spoil for you. He is the good guy, right? He is the moral force in this movie. And so it connects that to white people. Again, he's the savior, and he is out of place in his own country, but it becomes a hero in this in India in this film. And again, yeah, he travels to an exotic location. He's in rural India, helping these sort of poor villagers with their problem. So it's a classic white savior movie. And again, there's lots of them out there. This is a few of them, but there are many, many more. So white people are the dominant group in the US and Canada, and part of the reason for that is historical, right? So white people have been in charge of the US and Canada for quite some time. They have created society in a way that gives advantage to them and disadvantages other people. And a lot of the social messaging in terms of media, movies, television, etc., normalizes the white point of view. It sort of reinforces the idea that whiteness is better. Okay, so we have all of this stuff happening, but what's interesting is that we do have a group of white supremacists, and so there are a group of people who are very strongly racist against non-white ethnicities. But what's interesting is that even though the statistics demonstrate that white people clearly have power in the US and Canada, white supremacists don't agree with this. White supremacists feel that white people are actually under attack, that somehow they are powerless or they are losing their power. And so that in part fuels some of their activities. And so to talk about this in a little more detail, I would like to ask you to read an article. And so it's called White Supremacy: An Overview. And so I put it into Student Portal under Course Documents, and I've put it into Microsoft Teams under Files. And so it's in both places. There's one file that is the article itself, and it's only a few pages long. And then there's another document that is the questions that I want you to answer. And of course, the questions are the ones that were just on the screen here. So what I would like you to do, please, what I would like you to do is read the article. It's not very long. It's only 2 or 3 pages long. Answer the questions, and then we can come back and talk about them and what they mean. Yeah, that's what I want you to do. So let me look. Okay. So what I'll do, since we have 20 minutes left, I think that 20 minutes will be just the amount of time you need to read this thing and get your answers ready. So I think what I'll do is I'll let you take the rest of the time today to read the article, finish the questions, and then first thing tomorrow we will take up those questions, okay? And we'll talk about what's in that article, and we'll talk about what it means. It's a really easy read, so don't panic. It shouldn't be an issue. Before I turn you loose to do that, do you have any questions? Do you have any questions, or are you good? Okay, Baha says no. Casey's good. I know you're good, Casey. Come on. Sam says no. Do I need to? Nope. Don't. Just keep it for yourself, and we'll type out the answers so you can put them in the live chat tomorrow. But we'll talk about them tomorrow, Jimmy. So, yeah, don't turn them in. Other questions, or are you good? Nasheed has no questions. Okay. Thika's good. Okay. Karen's got a little thumbs up there. Okay, so I'll turn you loose on that. Again, the article is called White Supremacy: An Overview. You'll see it in Student Portal. You'll see it in Microsoft Teams, and then you'll see another document with the questions you need to answer. And so it's not a difficult article, but it tells us about a bunch of things that I would like us to be aware of so we can talk about, okay? Okay, so that said, I'm gonna let you get to it. We'll take those things up first thing tomorrow. Yeah, so if I don't see you in comparative cultures in half an hour or so, then I hope you have a nice day. If you're here in Vancouver, it looks pretty lovely out, so that's cool. For the rest of you, I'll see you in comparative cultures shortly, okay? So get to work, type out your answers, and we'll deal with this tomorrow, okay? So see ya.